The jury that found him guilty of murder, that same jury has got to decide whether he lives or whether he dies. Let's bring in psychiatrist Dr. Dion Metzger and neurologist Dr. Mitzi Williams, as I like to call the medical dream team, is with me. We are so lucky to have you because this is complicated stuff. This is complicated.
Oh, absolutely.
And I know you both, besides being busy doctors, you have now become like trial prep experts. And so you watch the testimony, so we're all on the same page. And the both of you said your big issue is that there was no PET scan or MRI done. Now, is this something, Dr. Metzger, I'll start with you. This is something that you would prescribe?
Oh, absolutely. And we work directly with the neurologist to do that. When we have any concerns about any kind of brain injury or any kind of acute change in behavior, that's usually one of the next steps that we do. We go and take a look at the MRI to see if there's any kind of diagnostic scan that can help us.
Without those tests, doctor, can you come to a medical conclusion? Can you come to any kind of certainty as to someone's condition?
Right. So you can have signs or symptoms of certain conditions, but the MRI tells you the etiology or the cause of it, right? So, the thing that the neurologist was talking about was, were these symptoms related to potential mini strokes from atrial fibrillation, or was it related to actual damage, physical damage to the brain from all of these traumatic brain injury in the past?
Okay, because, atrial fibrillation, big word.
Right.
What does it mean?
Big word. So it's an abnormality in how the heart is beating. And so when you notice it happens in the atrium, so the heart has the atrium and the atrial ventricles. So what it does is just some kind of abnormal beating that can lead to,
Strokes.
Strokes.
Right.
Okay.
My neurologist.
Okay. Yes. No. This is good.
Right.
Tag team.
Right.
Go
So
ahead.
the primary thing that we're concerned about with atrial fibrillation is actual clinical stroke, because basically, if the heart is not beating properly, the blood basically kind of pools, and if blood pools, it can cause a clot. And if those clots are then at some later point pumped out of the heart, they can go straight to the brain and cause a blockage and cause a stroke.
And how does that affect behavior?
So with stroke, we've actually seen quite a difference in terms of behavior. We see it can cause depressive symptoms, it can cause impulsive behavior. We've seen, that's probably the primary things that we see in terms of changes after a stroke.
Okay, another part of this testimony that's confusing me is, what's the connection between the atrial fibrillation issue and his history, or at least self-reported history, of the head injuries? Because so he had there was a head injury when a 9-year-old on a bike. Then he was hit with a beer bottle. Maybe he's a little older than that. He's been in car accidents. He's engaged in head banging since he was 16 years old. And even when he was older in federal prison, he reported head banging. So I don't know, what's the connection?
So there's not a connection per se between the two. Basically, what seems to be kind of the argument here is that there are two reasons for him to potentially have behavioral problems, right? Because if someone has enough mini strokes, in some cases they can have cognitive problems, typically what we call vascular dementia, which is not really what they were describing in terms of impulsivity.
Is dementia like memory?
So dementia is a memory problem. But sometimes if people have enough of those mini strokes, they can develop a type of dementia from those mini strokes, so to speak. But also chronic traumatic brain injury can also cause memory difficulty and some difficulty with cognition, as we discussed. So I think it was more not that there's a connection between the two, but that these are two possible reasons for him to have some potential behavioral problems.
Okay, the head bang.
Yes.
And again, this is self-reporting, so this is what he's saying. Because right now, I don't believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there has been independent, outside evidence of many of his medical conditions. Because, if there's tests, right?
Right.
Like for AFib or something like that.
And we haven't seen any of those.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Now, for the head banging, if someone engaged in this behavior, head banging, 16 years old, would that tell you, psychiatrist Dr. Metzger, that there could be a psychiatric problem?
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes we can see it in autism. We've seen it in a whole bunch of different diagnoses. But it would be something that I would want to do follow-up testing, first of all, to make sure there's no injury from the actual banging, but also just to see if there's anything else that could be causing it.
So that is something where you would say PET scan, MRI, something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. And now, let me, with respect to, you heard testimony that his mother, people said she had mental health issues. I think the word schizophrenic was thrown around. Again, no outside independent corroboration of that. And then the father engaged in certain behavior that perhaps could be seen as a psychological condition, perhaps. What is the genetic connection between parents and children with mental illness?
Oh, well, you definitely can see it come, you know, you can see it in the children as well as even nieces and nephews. It's something that, but from the parent to the child, you can definitely see the diagnoses. You can see them come again, especially with something like schizophrenia.
But is there anything from what you've seen about his testimony that indicates schizophrenia, or could it be something else?
There's nothing that jumps out at me. And we talked about the flat affect before, which just means his kind of lack of emotion, but that can be seen in like antisocial traits. We can see that in schizophrenia. We can see that even in depressive symptoms. So that's not really very kind of specific in terms of what I've seen.
Now, when you say antisocial traits, so are you referring to antisocial personality
Yes.
disorder? Okay,
Yes.
can you give us just some signs of that?
Sure. So it's just lack of empathy, doing things without kind of fear of consequence. So they make kind of these poor choices and they're not thinking about others, they're just doing whatever is best for them. But it's a really common diagnosis that we see with people who have a legal history, where they're just making all these decisions. They tend to have some kind of narcissistic ways in terms of they're only thinking of themselves and they're doing whatever needs to be done in order to, whether it's to get money or to get back at somebody, but it's just that kind of lack of empathy for others and just making poor decisions. And usually it's something that you can see the traits as early as childhood.
From what you are seeing now at this point, do you feel that the defense is bringing out like various issues? So he may have had head injuries, he had AFib, he has parents who have psychological conditions, all trying to put part and parcel together for someone who's very damaged. Is that what you're seeing so far?
I think that is the argument, yes.
Are you seeing that?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, and I want to, let me ask you, Dr. Williams, when it comes to the neuropsychologist, just if you could explain to us who goes first, because so in the testimony, we had the neuropsychologist testify first and referred to tests that were done by another doctor. We're not sure if it's a psychologist, psychiatrist, but it must have been a psychologist because testing, this Dr. Ming. Now we heard from the neurologist. But what happens first, like in terms of these testing? Like if you're going to say, I want memory tests or verbal tests or IQ tests, which are done by a neuropsychologist or psychologist, do you see the patient first, or does that psychologist see the patient first?
Right, so it can work both ways, but oftentimes someone will be referred to a neurologist. For instance, someone will come in with signs of potential concussive syndrome. Let's say something happened at a game, they go to the hospital and they refer to a neurologist. And then based on my exam and interpretation, if the symptoms have not improved, then oftentimes we will refer to a neuropsychologist for further testing. Or if I see someone with any diagnosis where there are psychological issues that I think need to be quantified, then I may send them to a neuropsychologist for evaluation.
Okay, and what about with you in terms of a psychiatrist-psychologist connection?
Usually we're the first stop. So they usually come
Really?
to
Okay.
the MD first just to kind of get an evaluation because they want to rule out if there's anything else going on, and then we refer them on.
And just give us some examples of some tests that you would do.
So definitely the test that we saw, the Wechsler test, the intelligence, where we're looking at executive functioning, just kind of like a battery of tests that we usually do, but the Wechsler is usually very telling for us.
All right, well, I'm not going to let you start with the Wechsler because you're going to have to come back. No, come back. We're going to go back into courtroom right now.
Okay.
But then we are going to get nitty gritty about these tests that Scott Nelson had performed. But yes, let's go back to more of Dr. Robert Woe, still on the stand.